As much as we're here to talk about sleep, it's the impact that we have on people. It could be anybody, anybody watching this or a family member. Go ahead and relay the story again of how one moment changes lives.
I'm 100% sure he had no idea that, something that he said in the class would change the life of a student forever. So we are living in a world where it's trying to get you to do stuff 24 hours a day. And as a result of all of those strings attached to you, the average American only sleeps about 6.5 hours. In other words, if someone starts a sleeping pill and they stop the sleeping pill, the problem comes back. And so for insomnia, if somebody's got chronic insomnia and in the clinic, you see people who have failed at treatment. Their family doctor has failed and they have not been able to get on top of the issue. Everybody wakes up 4 to 5 times during the night. The awakenings are usually very short. In fact, up to 5 awakenings per hour is considered normal, but they're very, very short. And because of a phenomenon called retrograde amnesia, you don't even remember having awakened during the night.
So, Dr. Kryger, it's so good to have you here. I read a lot about you, and you are literally the OG. I mean, you are the guru on sleep medicine. And I want to say congratulations because this year is the 50-year anniversary of when you first discovered or brought to light apnea, which we know is one of the biggest problems with sleep with people in the world. So congratulations on that. It's so good to have you here on Born SuperHuman.
Thank you. It's a real thrill to be here.
I really appreciate it. So I want you to explain to people how you got into being, and I'm just going to hit you right with it. When I read about you, and I read so many doctors, so many professors that turn around and say, I can't believe that I got to work with Dr. Kryger, or he came into Yale University. And I know you had said they took a risk on you, and everyone there's like, we didn't take a risk. We got the opportunity to learn from you. So go ahead and explain to everybody the power of you.
Well, the power of me kind of started like a lot of things. It was a fluke that I got into this field of sleep medicine. And it really started in the very early 1970s. I was a very inquisitive medical resident. And I had a patient that didn't fit what was in the books. The patient was very sleepy. The patient was having seizures during sleep. He was obese. And I can recall that one night I'm doing rounds in the hospital. I go into his room and I see that he's struggling with breathing. Okay. Of course, I didn't know what to do at that point with that information. And I contacted a friend of mine who was a neurosurgery resident in the same hospital. And I said, let's study this guy to see what's going on. What we found is that he stopped breathing during sleep. And what we also found is that his heart would stop for up to 10 seconds. And that was the explanation for the seizures that he was having during sleep. So again, I was always inquisitive and I wanted to understand more about what was going on with him, did a bunch of tests and determined that his problem was with his upper airway, which was collapsing when he was sleeping. And as it turned out, that was, and I published the case. And as it turned out, it was the first real description of what we now call the obstructive sleep apnea syndrome in North America. And at the time, there was no field of sleep medicine. It did not exist. Everybody, the impression that everybody had was you sleep, nothing can possibly go wrong, you wake up and that's it. And that patient actually changed my life in that I started to think about what happens during sleep. And it turned out there was nothing published really at that point about clinical sleep medicine. And I dove right into the field. Why? because there was nothing known about it. It was like the unknown. It was a frontier. And so that's how I got into the field. And I then trained in Colorado, and I did sleep studies in people living at high altitude who had a disease called chronic mountain sickness. And that again was fascinating to me. And we were able to actually treat those patients who ended up having sleep disorders. And when I finally finished training, which was at the University of Colorado, my wife and we moved to Canada. I started the first sleep lab and clinic to study respiratory breathing problems during sleep. And I spent the rest of my career in sleep, doing research, organizing textbooks, stuff like that. The irony is that my path and the paths of many, many people, when you go back and you look at your own path, you realize that there were little things that happened to you that changed everything. That one patient changed everything. And here I am, literally 50 years later, talking to you about sleep.
Unbelievable. But what were you doing before that? What was your focus before you discovered this fascination and ability to break down sleep disorders?
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story about this. So when I was a second year medical student at McGill and University of Montreal, we had a professor whose name was Sir Wilder Penfield, who was at the time the best known neurosurgeon in the world. If someone in Russia needed a neurosurgeon, they would fly this guy over. And I had met this neurosurgeon years before, when I was younger, when my father became comatose and was admitted to the Montreal Neurological Hospital. One night I go visit my father, and this gentleman is he's next to my father with gadgets on his head. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm using radar to figure out what's wrong with your dad." So radar is ultrasound. Okay, radar is ultrasound. It was one of the first uses of ultrasound, and he operated my father. My father woke up. Anyway, so at that point, I decided I want to be a neurosurgeon like Wilder Penfield. So years later, I'm in second year, sort of in my neuroanatomy, neurosurgery course at Yale. And Wilder Penfield says to the class, "You can only become a neurosurgeon if you're really good with your hands." Okay. And I was a klutz. Okay. I was a klutz. So right then and there, I decided, well, maybe I should listen to this guy and find other interests. And I got interested in breathing. I got interested in the upper airway, and this patient kind of appeared, and it was a complete fluke that I had exactly the right kind of interests to be able to study this gentleman. So that's my story. I mean, that's the backstory of before I really went into sleep.
So, with that being said, you told me a story earlier. I'd love you to tell a story, because I think, as much as we're here to talk about sleep, it's the impact that we have on people. It could be anybody watching this, or a family member. Go ahead and relay the story again of how one moment changes lives.
Yeah, so just like Wilder Penfield really changed the direction of my life, I'm 100% sure he had no idea that, something that he said in the class would change the life of a student forever. And maybe he changed the lives of other students as well. It reminded me of an episode that happened years later, when my middle son was graduating from high school. He was the valedictorian of his class, and the young lady who was second in the class, I met her after the various ceremonies, and she was from the Philippines. And I asked her what she was going to do with her life, because she just graduated from high school. And she said to me she wanted to go into nursing. And I was thinking, well, should I tell her this or not? And I said, well, I'm going to tell her. I said, you came in second in the school. of a big school. You're really bright, and maybe you should consider other options, maybe medical school, something else like that. And that was the whole discussion. And years later, I learned that she had indeed gone to medical school and was now a practicing pediatrician. So so years later, whether my words alone changed things, but what I gave her was the possibility that she could expand her horizon, and that was absolutely thrilling when I finally learned that she went into medical school and became a doctor.
It's fantastic. I'm a huge believer in planting seeds, but we don't actually know when we plant them that we're actually planting. So your words got heard and then they started to blossom or bloom within her thought process. And if I go back to how, one professor changed your life, the subsequent effect is really, in your case, it became a flood of changing other people's lives. Because we know that sleep is a major issue in people's health. And that's why in the 7 pillars I have for natural health, number 3 is sleep. And it's so critical. And it could go above that, but oxygen for me is number 1. And then hydration is number 2, because if we don't hydrate, our brain can't function. But sleep is above nutrition, above exercise, because again, it's how our brain and body's affected. So one of the questions that I've got a ton of questions to ask you, but let's go into first off, how bad a problem is sleep? Let's just start with America, but I'm sure it covers the whole world.
It is a huge problem. It is a huge problem, and if you were going to try to decide where the problem started, and which person was responsible, you have to go all the way back to Thomas Edison, the invention of the light bulb, electricity. All of a sudden, the world became a 24-hour-a-day world. In other words, you could work at night. You could have factories operating at night. In the early 20th century, Henry Ford introduces the assembly line running 24 hours a day, and the world changed. And the world changed sort of in clusters, right? So the world became electrified in the early parts of the 20th century, and there were all these sort of minor revolutions that happened. And the last revolution that sort of happened, I call it a revolution, you might call it something else, is the introduction of the internet. Because what the internet did was not only it turned the whole world into a 24-hour world. And it's crazy. If you have a problem with your computer and you call up tech support, chances are you're going to speak to someone who's like 8 or 9 time zones away. Could be somebody from India, could be somebody from the Philippines, it could be somebody from Texas. You have no idea where that person actually is. When you order something from Amazon, just think about the process that's involved, because you could be ordering something at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I've had situations where I've ordered something and the damn thing gets delivered on the same day. And who knows what the pathway was of all that information. So we are living in a world where it's trying to get you to do stuff 24 hours a day. And as a result of all of those strings attached to you, the average American only sleeps 6.5 hours. And is that enough? On the average, it is way not enough. The average American should be sleeping 7 to 9 hours. And if you talk to sort of your topic is being superhuman. If you look at the amount of sleep that real superhumans have, world-class athletes, they're nowhere even close to 7 to 9 hours. Many of them are 10 to 12 hours. And I can show you a graph of that if you want. If you want me to share my screen, I could show you, but it's fascinating how Simone Biles sleeps 10 to 12 hours. LeBron James sleeps 12 hours. And I've actually recently compiled a list of almost 20 world-class athletes, and guess what? They're all more than 8 hours a night, and many of them are more than 10 hours a night. And so there's no question that if you have a society that on the average sleeps 6.5 hours, and the superhumans of that society are sleeping, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that the 6.5 is just not enough.
It's fascinating because when I was an athlete back in England, I would sleep easily 10 hours. I remember one time I became a professional dancer and, ballet, jazz, tap, all the other stuff. And I remember sleeping almost 24 hours straight at the end of the semester because I was just exhausted. But my body
Yeah.
would try and sleep. I mean, I was working from the moment I woke up to the moment I go to sleep, but it was either work or sleep. And my
Yeah.
energy levels were off the charts to be able to continue. Now, in American society, it became, and I went through this. You're gonna be shocked when I tell you what I went through. But I started a business, and we're always told it's great to say we're busy. Oh, I'm so busy, or I've got so much going on, because that's almost a status symbol that I'm important. Well, I opened up a sports performance gym, and for about 4.5 years, I never slept more than 3 hours a night. I was sleeping between 1 and 3 hours every night and getting going. And I thought it was a status symbol until I started understanding what happens to the brain. And not just immediately, the long-term effect of lack of sleep catches up with you. Go ahead and tell us, more about the effect of lack of sleep.
If you look at mortality, in other words, how likely you are to die, or a population, I mean, I couldn't tell you. I mean, if you told me that you sleep 4 hours a night, I couldn't tell you whether you have an increased mortality rate or not. But if I have 10,000 people and I look at mortality for the population, I could say that your mortality is going to be increased if in the population of people that sleep 4 hours. On the other hand, there are many people that sleep a lot, that sleep 12, 13, 14, 15 hours a night. They also have an increased mortality. And many of those patients, we think, actually may have a disease that makes them sleepy. Okay, so the situation is, so it's like a U-shaped curve. So the situation is complicated. It seems like for a given person, there's an ideal amount of sleep, and most people have a really good idea of how much sleep they actually need in order to wake up wide awake and alert and feeling great. Most people know this, and sometimes even losing a half an hour of sleep, you have to go get an airplane or something, and you have to wake up earlier than you normally do. Your whole day can be shot because you're now very, very sleepy. So the main symptom we see with sleep deprivation. We see acute sleep deprivation causing sleepiness during the daytime, performance decrements. Athletes, if they haven't slept well the night before, their performance is terrible. In fact, that's been studied in universities. They've actually looked at the whether you get in, if you're playing basketball, how accurate you are depending on how much sleep you have gotten. So there's a performance decrement, and there's also a cognitive decrement. I mean, if you're really sleepy, you shouldn't be an air traffic controller that day. That kind of thing. And the impact could be catastrophic. I had a patient when I was living in Canada. I had a patient who was a pilot, and this patient he was flying between Vancouver and Hong Kong, and on one of the on one of the trips, he had gone to Hong Kong, and he couldn't sleep when he was over there. That's a big problem when you switch a lot of time zones. Your sleep may not be normal. Didn't sleep, flew the airplane coming back, and literally fell asleep while landing the airplane in Vancouver. And the co-pilot had to take over, and he was referred to me like, what is wrong with this guy? But so the results can be catastrophic, and probably there are lots of examples of people falling asleep driving trains, ships, you name it. They're cars, trucks. The transportation industry is really a big industry where sleep deprivation plays a big, it's important to maintain sleep in the transportation industry, because not only can you harm yourself, you can harm other people, and I've seen that many, many times. over the years where somebody has fallen asleep driving and there were catastrophic outcomes. So it can be dangerous that way. The other danger is a little bit longer term where you start to see comorbidities happening, things going wrong with metabolism, with blood pressure, for example. We know that people who are sleep deprived, they produce too much of certain hormones. Ghrelin is an example that makes them eat more and they become overweight. And we see this even in young children who are sleep deprived. They tend to become obese. So, and obesity, of course, has a whole bunch of comorbidities associated with it, cardiovascular disease and hypertension and so forth. So these are all there are many things that go wrong. And in the last little while, there's been a big kind of emphasis on research of, is there a role or is there a relationship between sleep and the development of diseases like Alzheimer's, dementias? And the data that's coming out seems to suggest that there is a relationship, and the relationship may be related to something that was only discovered in the last 7 or 8 years, which is a whole something called the glymphatic system. These are vessels in the brain that remove waste products from the brain. And these channels seem to open up during sleep. And it could be that what happens during sleep is you clear these waste products from your brain, and they go into your circulation where you deal with them, and they don't stick in your brain and clog things up. So we're still in a very exciting phase of sleep research. We're still learning, we're still understanding, but what we do know is that sleep is damn important and people need to make it a priority.
So I know you said there's the U-shaped curve to mortality. What
Yeah.
for you, I know when I was an athlete and training really hard, my body was more drained than sitting at a computer, but my
Yeah.
brain is still working, obviously, when I'm sitting at a computer. What in that U-shape is your ideal suggestion for sleep?
Well, my ideal for the population, it's 7 to 9 hours.
Okay.
Okay. 6.5 is simply not enough for the average person. And just like you mentioned that you went through a phase in your career where it was macho to only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night, there are politicians whose name I will not mention who brag about the fact that they hardly sleep, and they have said things like, I can make money by not sleeping, and that sleep is a waste of time. And so are they impairing themselves? Are they harming themselves? We don't know. There are some people that seem to function well on less sleep, and it's interesting because the military is always trying to find methods of sort of screening people, and let's find soldiers who only need to sleep 2, 3, 4 hours, and that becomes a challenge for them. Will they ever find people that'll do well on 2, 3, 4 hours of sleep? I don't know. I don't think so, but who knows?
Yeah, I went through 8 years of Royal Marine Cadet training from the age of 10 through to 18. And part of the training was to train you to not need enough sleep. And I
Yeah.
wonder how much of that is also part of the PTSD later on in life, because we've trained ourselves not to heal through the process of sleep for the demand to be able to perform. And going back to what you were saying about the politicians, I'm a huge fan of Celine Dion, and you look at all the money she got, and she just had the most incredible performance in the opening ceremony of the Olympics.
It was unbelievable. Yeah.
For me, it's the greatest performance within any event at the Olympics. But I know she'd give the money back to not be suffering the way she is. And no matter if you're staying up making money, what are you doing to your long-term health? And I know hers isn't related to sleep, but still, if you're looking at money over health, we look at so many people that would say, I would give everything to have my health back.
Yeah. And virtually every neurological disorder, almost every significant neurological disorder, including diseases that are so-called muscle diseases, it turns out that most of them also have a neurological deficit of some sort. In other words, that there are very few diseases that are neurological, muscular, that do not affect the brain. I would be surprised with, I don't know that much about her disease specifically, but there are other diseases that I am aware of that are muscle diseases. Myotonic dystrophy is one, which is a muscular dystrophy. And years ago, it was thought, oh, it's a muscle disease and that's it. It turns out that they have all sorts of central neurological issues as well. And that's one of the fascinating things about the brain, one of the fascinating things about sleep. It is related to everything. When I was a medical student, every organ was sort of studied separately. You studied the heart as though it was not in a body. You studied the lungs as though they were not in a body, not connected to anything. And we now know that, the rhythm of the heart is controlled by the nervous system. It's not the heart. In other words, if you take out somebody's beating heart and put it into someone else, it still needs connections from a nervous system in order to, for example, change how it reacts during exercise, how it reacts when someone has a lot of anxiety. In other words, there have to be, and there are connections from the brain to all the organ systems, the GI tract, certainly the respiratory system, where the entire control of breathing is actually regulated by brain mechanisms.
The autonomic system, which obviously keeps us alive. That's when we look at the brain, it's there for two reasons, right? It's there to keep us safe and keep us alive. That's the purpose of the brain. And so the things that we take for granted are actually very much engaged. But you brought up a word in there that I think is very dynamic: anxiety.
Yeah.
We know lack of sleep also brings up emotional responses.
Yeah.
So when someone has anxiety, what would you suggest, or what information could you give them to help them get to sleep? Because the more sleep we get, I believe, the less anxiety we're going to induce.
In some cases, the anxiety may be related to something like post-traumatic stress disorder. I worked for 5 years at a VA hospital here in Connecticut as part of my job. And almost every veteran that I saw who had been in combat in Vietnam, for example, had some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder. And many of them had symptoms that were quite severe, nightmares, and very often they never told their family members about these nightmares that they were having, sometimes every single night. But when I spoke to them, they would tell me about these nightmares, and I've written about some of these nightmares that they would have. And they developed an anxiety about falling asleep. I don't want to sleep because I don't want to have nightmares. So, and then if you don't sleep enough, you become more anxious and you become irritable, cranky, and so it becomes like a vicious circle. So if someone has anxiety because of something stressful at work or in the family, they need to recognize that they're anxious, and they need to recognize that they need to get on top of the anxiety in order to really deal with whatever is going on in their life. I've seen several interviews during the Olympics with Simone Biles. And as most of the public remembers, she really, with the last Olympics, she basically had anxiety, who knows what, and she couldn't perform, and she withdrew. And now she talks about how she controls her life, how she controls how she feels. She happens to go to a therapist, she said, about once a week or something like that. And you watch her, and she's calm. She has learned to control whatever it was that made her withdraw from the Olympics 4 years ago. And if every person was able to learn how to do that, anxiety would go away as a problem.
Yeah, I agree. Watching Simone on that, I've never seen her look so peaceful, happy, and content, even in the face of competition. I mean, the ultimate competition for gymnasts, for sure. And again, being able to, I think it's a byproduct, like you said, studying the body as individual pieces is the same as studying all the individual anxiety, depression, all the other emotional and psychological effects are part of sleep?
Yeah,
Because
they're all part of sleep. And if we look at the universe of mental disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disease, depression, major depressive disorder, for example, they all have an element of something going wrong with their sleep. And the other thing that plays a role in this are the medications that are being used to treat people with these mental disorders. Any drug you take, any compound you take that has an effect on the brain is going to have an effect on sleep. So many of the antidepressants will make people sleepy. In some cases, it may cause them to develop restless legs or movement disorders. And some of the products that people use for sleep that are available over the counter, for example, the first generation antihistamines, for example, Benadryl, those are terrible for sleep. They can cause movement disorders. They cause grogginess during the daytime. And they've now been linked to having an increased risk of dementia long term. And so you ask yourself the question, how come products like this are even available? And I'm sort of amazed at the products that are available, that you can just go and buy, where the consumer is not given the real information about the dangers of the product, or they should be withdrawn.
right. So that brings me a perfect transition here. What then is the protocol that people should do if they're suffering from sleep deprivation or finding it hard to sleep? What would you suggest? And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the circadian rhythm, talk about light, because I know our ancestors in the caves would get up when it was light and go to sleep when it was dark, which brings in the length of sleep. What is the protocol that we should do, especially if we're suffering from sleep deprivation, because the frustration comes in and that keeps us awake?
So now, when I see patients in the clinic, when I've seen patients in the clinic, they have tried everything on their own before coming and seeing a sleep specialist, and they were not successful at dealing with their sleep issue, whatever it was. The first thing that people need to recognize is that they have a problem, and in other words, if someone wakes up every morning and doesn't feel great, feels groggy, needs to have 1, 2, 3, 4 cups of coffee in order to function, they have a problem. So the first thing that needs to happen is recognition that there is a problem. You don't want to know you have a problem when you have fallen asleep driving and you've killed a passenger. You want that hint much earlier and react to it. So knowing that there's a problem and then making sleep a priority and working on the sleep issue, whatever it is. So, for example, if someone is going to bed at midnight and waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning because they have a long commute or something like that, they need to realize they need more than 5 hours of sleep. And what do they need to do? They need to make sleep a priority and either change their job or go to bed earlier. They're certainly going to be sleepy enough to fall asleep earlier. And people need to kind of sometimes tease apart all the possible things that are causing their sleep to be abnormal. Is it a pet who jumps into the bed at 4 o'clock? I literally remember having a patient who came to my clinic at the VA, and he told me he's very tired during the night and he only sleeps about 4 to 5 hours. And I say, tell me about your night. He says, I fall asleep right away. 4 o'clock in the morning, my 4 German shepherds jump into the bed. I got to take them out for a walk. And I'm thinking, you came to the doctor with this as a problem. It's the dogs that are the problem. You're not the problem. The way you're reacting to what your dogs need is a problem. You need to deal with that. And so people need to start to think about, why is their sleep abnormal? Is it stress? Are they thinking about the first meeting the next day and they're not ready for it? They need to think about it, and they need to start prioritizing stuff. If they're taking too much coffee, they need to reduce the amount of coffee. If they're having trouble sleeping at night and they have one of these days where they wake up early in the morning, they work for 2 to 3 hours, then they take a 2 to 3 hour nap. Is that good? That's crazy, because it's going to interfere with your nighttime sleep if you nap for 3 hours. people do that. And so if a person cannot solve their own sleep problem, they shouldn't go to their doctor and ask for sleeping pills. That's the last thing that should happen. They should go to their doctor. If they can't solve it and their doctor can't solve it, is to be referred to a specialist who deals with these kinds of problems every day. And that's, that's really the best way of kind of looking at it. But the first thing is people need to make sleep a priority, that this is important. It's as important as eating. It's as important as exercise. It's critically important. It's as important as water.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, again, in my list, it's higher than exercise and eating, because if you're not sleeping, your body's not functioning to be able
Yeah,
to breaking it down. And like
yeah,
we know, the sleep helps the brain, but it also is the time the body gets to heal as well. The brain can take care of the body and deal with issues. With that ideology, it seems, going back to what you said about Thomas Edison and the 24-hour, we also become dopamine addicts, where we want to be entertained the whole time. Whereas I remember when I was growing up, the TV went off. It actually went till midnight some nights. Then you'd have the screen that would come up and the loud beep, and you knew
yeah.
if you're falling asleep, you go to bed, there's nothing to watch. Now we want to be entertained all the time, which is where the cell phones come in, the computers, the TV, 24 hours. We can't sleep. What's the first thing we do? We go to our screens, which, with the blue light against what the world is teaching us in its natural beauty with the sunrise and sunset. Do you think a lot of that comes down to people's discipline of, again, I know you said prioritizing?
Yeah, part of it is discipline, and part of it is that they've never really thought about it. I can remember looking at a sleep study. When we do sleep studies, we video record the entire night. And I remember a patient who was an 18-year-old young woman, young woman, who was sleeping with her cell phone in her hand the entire night. And in the middle of the night, she got a call. She responded to the call, spoke to the person, and the next morning had no idea that this had happened. And we had proof of it. Here was the phone call. You answered it, you spoke, and this is not good. And imagine during the night you have a cell phone, people are texting you, it's pinging, it's making noise. It's going to have an effect on you. And people need to not sleep with electronics on them or even in the room. I tell people to get rid of alarm clocks, for example. I tell them to stop using a screen for 1 or 2 hours before bedtime because of the light. We know that light is an arousing stimulus, and it can actually keep you from falling asleep. But a lot of people just don't know that, and maybe with programs like yours, they will learn about the importance of these things.
So really it goes down to, again, as you said, putting enough priority on the need to sleep, making it important as eating, sleeping, the things you love, giving you more energy. And then once you do that, how do I do it? And again, there's no quick fix. I think that's part of the issue with the Benadryl or to fall asleep. I want the quick fix, but I don't want to have to do the work.
Yeah, and the quick fix never works. In other words, if someone starts a sleeping pill and they stop the sleeping pill, the problem comes back. And so for insomnia, if somebody's got chronic insomnia, and in the clinic, you see people who have failed at treatment. Their family doctor has failed, and they have not been able to get on top of the issue. What we recommend, and it's a durable treatment, is what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, which has a bunch of elements to it. Usually it's done by a psychologist, and they basically teach the person how to fall asleep again. When we grew up, we all knew how to fall asleep. Nobody had to teach us how to fall asleep, but many of us, or many people, as they became older and they got jobs and they started taking medications, whatever, they forgot how to fall asleep again. It became a struggle. They had to work at it. And the ideal situation is where sleep is automatic. It's like breathing. You get tired, you go to bed, you fall asleep. It's like breathing. It's like your heartbeat. You don't have to think about it. It just happens, right? And that's what the body is designed to do.
With that, and again, all great points. What happens if somebody does go to sleep on a regular schedule, but they find they're waking up 3 or 4 times a night? Why is that happening? And is there a fix for it that is, again, protocol?
The First of all, everybody wakes up 4 to 5 times during the night. The awakenings are usually very short. In fact, it up to 5 awakenings per hour is considered normal, but they're very, very short. And because of a phenomenon called retrograde amnesia, you don't even remember having awakened during the night. Now, some people have they'll wake up and they'll go to the bathroom, go back to bed, and then they'll start thinking, they'll start ruminating. And so when someone wakes up several times during the night, you need to look at the reasons why this is happening. Sometimes it could be noise, it could be a pet, it could be it could be a bed partner who's snoring or who's twitching or who's moving a lot, or it's an electronic device that is in the bed, or it's a medical problem. In most postmenopausal women, for example, they start to urinate at night several times. It's a physiologic change in the way the bladder is actually controlled. Men will have the problem with an enlarging prostate, and they will go to the bathroom at night much more frequently. And they need to discuss this with their doctor. It turns out that in a condition called sleep apnea, where people stop breathing during sleep, that one of the main symptoms that a lot of patients don't even appreciate is related to breathing is going to the bathroom at night. And one of the first things that a lot of patients tell us when they've been started on treatment is, doc, I don't have to go to the bathroom at night anymore. I can sleep right through the night. And so people need to pay attention, and doctors may need to sort of problem solve to try to figure out what is causing the awakenings during the night.
So what happens if somebody stresses that they're going to wake up during the night,
Mm-hmm.
and then that causes them to wake up because they're
Oh
focused
yeah.
on
Oh
the.
yeah. In other words, their brains are sort of hyper alert at that point. Any noise sort of wakes them up. They're anxious and they wake up and they start thinking about the first meeting that they're going to have that day. And a simple fix for some people is simply to tell them, when you get to bed and you're the kind of person that wakes up thinking about what's going to happen, take a little notebook and just write down whatever it is that you would be thinking about when you woke up at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And you'd be amazed at how often you're not going to wake up anymore at 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning. In other words, you've already the problem to bed, and for a lot of people, that's very, very helpful.
So I remember reading, and I don't know when this happened, but you had written something about don't read too much into dreams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you said maybe there's more to dreams than we think.
5,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, people were into the interpretation of dreams. You dream something, and this is what the dream means, right? And, even Sigmund Freud, Sigmund Freud in 1900 comes out with a book called The Interpretation of Dreams, in which, he describes you're dreaming this, it means that, right? And we don't believe that anymore. We don't understand why we dream. We don't understand why we are paralyzed during dreams. We are not physically able to respond to what we are dreaming. And there are some people that have a disease where the mechanism that keeps us paralyzed during sleep doesn't work properly anymore, and they physically react to the dream content. So if they're dreaming they're being attacked, they will fight off this imaginary intruder. I've seen dozens and dozens of cases like that over the years. It's called REM sleep behavior disorder. And when we first, and this is a disease that was only described in the mid 1980s. And although there are the symptom was actually described in novels, 200 years before that. Cervantes, for example, actually wrote about that. But anyways, so it turns out that people with that symptom of physically reacting to dreams, many of them will ultimately develop a neurocognitive disorder, a neurological disorder such as Parkinson's disease. So we see the symptom very often in Parkinson's. We see the symptom in Lewy body dementia. And so we're beginning to learn that we need to think about dreams. What is the mechanism that is causing this to happen? And there sometimes is what we call a very long prodrome. What I mean by that is that that symptom appears, but the rest of the symptoms don't appear for 20, 30, 40 years. And I remember one patient that I had who ended up with REM sleep behavior disorder. When he came to see me with his wife, he already had a neurocognitive disease. And his wife told me that on the day that she was married and they slept together for the first time, because there was a time when people didn't sleep together until they were actually married, she said he was fighting some imaginary creature in the bed, but the rest of the symptoms did not appear for like 30 or 40 years. So there are still a lot of mysteries in sleep that we don't understand at all. And you know, I teach an undergraduate course at Yale called The Mystery of Sleep. There are still a gazillion mysteries that we don't understand. And in some ways, that's fascinating to me because we still have a whole lot to learn.
So talk to me the difference between and the importance of REM sleep, deep sleep, and light sleep, because that tends to be the three areas that we tend to be judged on.
Yeah, and that's something which in the wearable world, whether it's an Apple Watch or whether it's a Fitbit or one device that I'm very familiar with, which is called a Circle ring, you get that kind of information, and the rings they don't measure your brain activity. They don't really know what stage of sleep you're in. They infer what stage of sleep you're in from physiologic measurements. Okay. So that's number one. So I can tell you that over the years, I've had dozens of patients coming in who had no complaints at all, any complaints with their sleep, but they said, you know, I bought an Oura ring and my Oura ring is telling me that I don't have enough REM sleep. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, who knows? And because they don't actually measure sleep directly. So basically, if somebody's using a wearable, they need to understand that the wearable really is not measuring things in the brain. Now, having said that, in a sleep laboratory, we do measure brain waves. We have stages of sleep. We have light sleep, which is typically stages 1 and 2. Then we have deep sleep, and deep sleep is a very interesting stage in humans because it is felt that that is the stage where your body does most of its repair, and which to me is sort of fascinating because that is when humans have a spike in growth hormone production. Is slow wave sleep. Rapid eye movement sleep is fascinating. And what's fascinating about it is it was discovered very late, in the sense that it wasn't until the 1950s that anybody discussed, anybody reported that there existed rapid eye movement sleep. And it's sort of funny when you think about it, that 50 years before, Sigmund Freud was talking about dreams, but he didn't really even know where dreams were, where they happened, how they happened, and what the physiologic correlates actually were. Having said all that, we now know that during REM sleep, we are paralyzed. We know that a lot of the physiologic functions become abnormal. It's like the body doesn't care as much about controlling blood pressure, pulse rate, and breathing. And breathing can become very abnormal in rapid eye movement sleep. And so it's almost like the brain is in a state where it doesn't care about keeping things normal. It's doing something. We don't know exactly what it is doing. We do believe it is involved in memory consolidation. That sleep is very important in storing memory. What I mean by storing memory is to use the computer analogy. It's taking memory that's in RAM and putting it on a hard drive to store it long term. And that's what sleep is involved in. It's involved in memory. It's involved in learning.
So as we're sleeping and our heart rate is going to drop, we know that the brain does put the body into a paralysis mode. I
Mhm.
guess it's because it's protecting us, because during the day, the brain is working to keep us safe. So now if it shuts the body down from moving, it knows it's in a safe environment at that moment for quick paralysis, quick whatever the brain's doing during sleep, and then coming back online again effectively. But what happens when someone has a much lower heart rate? For example, I'll tell you, my heart rate drops to 41 when I'm sleeping,
Uh-huh.
which then means my SpO2, my oxygen level in my blood, tends to drop because I'm not maybe beating as much heart blood around my body. Is that normal?
Well, your blood oxygen should not drop just because your heart rate drops. Now, the heart rate does drop in most people during sleep. Dropping to 41, we see those kind of very low heart rates in people who had been endurance athletes. Endurance athletes will have a low heart rate, 50, 60 tops. And then during sleep, it can go down into the 40s. And we start to worry when the heart rate drops into the 30s or below, because then you're not necessarily pushing enough blood and oxygen into the brain or in the heart itself. The heart needs oxygen as well. And so, and this is something that we see all the time in a clinic. Now, with some disorders, for example, blood pressure normally drops during sleep, and it drops continuously during the night. There isn't a whole lot of data on this, continuous data, because it's very hard to measure blood pressure continuously, although there are gadgets now that are going to be on the market fairly soon that can do that, beat by beat blood pressure. So there's people with some diseases, for example, with sleep apnea, their blood pressure doesn't go down. It stays the same or it goes up while they're sleeping. And so that can't be good for you to have an increase in blood pressure. And that may be the link between some of these sleep breathing disorders and for example, strokes. We know that people that have sleep breathing disorders are more prone to develop a stroke.
Fascinating. Like you said, there's always discoveries coming out. But I have to say, in the last 20 years, when we start looking at the neuroplasticity, the neurological side, understand the brain better, it seems to be changing more in understanding of modern medicine now. And
Yeah.
understand, I think a lot of the Eastern medicine, the things that were done naturally years ago, we're kind of heading back that way by understanding the body is, made to heal. We're brilliant. We just need to, again, support that healing process. So I know back in 2017, you went across to King's College in London
Mm-hmm.
and you did studying with their sleep medicine centers over there as well. Did you find a big difference between America approach and the European or the English approach?
No, as a matter of fact, so I went to Guy's Hospital, which had, and I think it still has, the biggest sleep clinic in the United Kingdom. They were terrific. Everything that they did was state of the art, and they were probably better than 95% of the clinics in the US. They were serious, they did great studies, and they were wonderful, wonderful clinicians. And so it was an honor to work with them. And it's people all over the world have sleep problems, and there was a time that the BBC, about once a month for years, I was on a BBC phone-in program that was in the middle of the night. It was the middle of the night for them, but for me, it was like 9 o'clock in the evening. And people would phone up and they would ask questions in the middle of the night. So these are people who were awake in the middle of the night because they weren't sleeping. They were talking to me and telling me about their problems, and the problems that they had were the same as the problems that we see here. Sleep apnea, anxiety, mental disorders. Some patients had disorders related to blindness as examples. And I'll tell you, medicine in the UK right now is going through a difficult period because of the government cutbacks in the last couple of years. But when I was there, I guess it's 7 years ago now, it was fabulous.
I know that you had said, and obviously there's the time frame from 2017 to today, in the middle of it was COVID.
Yeah.
And you talked a lot about the problems that came about because of COVID, whether it was fear related, out of sync with everyday life, boredom, sleeping during the day. What did you learn from going through that pandemic that would help moving forward if we go back into situations where we're out of normal sync?
Well, for a lot of things, we have not gone back to the way things were before. And you've probably noticed that there are a lot of restaurants where you go in and you're the only actual customer in the restaurant, but there's takeout going continuously. And so there are a lot of habits got picked up during COVID that have not kind of gone away. And during COVID, things were very difficult for doctors and patients because everything all of a sudden became telemedicine, and not being able to measure things directly on a patient became a real hurdle in treating them. And I had many patients on breathing machines, and I needed to know how they were doing. And that's when I became very interested in wearables that were accurate, that could actually monitor their blood oxygen. And I needed to make sure that whatever wearable I was going to recommend for a patient had been studied in people with dark skin pigment. For a variety of reasons. Some of the oximeters on the market were inaccurate in people with dark skin pigment. The process of seeing patients changed dramatically. I was in my home, usually my dining room, with a computer to make it look like it was an office, and I was literally doing house calls in patients' homes, right? And the house calls were, in some instances, very revealing because I was able to see the person's environment. I was able to talk to other people in the home, and to me that was something I when I was first a doctor, I used to make house calls. Okay. And then in the US, nobody does house calls. So all of a sudden I'm doing house calls over Zoom. And that was, I didn't want to do that, but it was interesting to interact with the person in their own environment. But during COVID itself, a lot of people had sleep problems because of anxiety. Nightmares were extremely common, especially at the beginning of COVID. And interestingly, many groups actually slept more during COVID than before COVID. For example, students, all of a sudden, they didn't have to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning anymore, and they would like sleep in. So ironically, there were some groups of people that actually slept more, but it was very, very challenging to teach. I was still teaching a course at Yale, and for when I was doing an entire course by Zoom, and this is the truth, I would have some students were in the US. I had some students in the UK, some students in the Far East, and some students in Australia at the same time, right? So imagine the time difference. So I'm giving a lecture at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my local time, and one of the students, I remember this one student who was living in the Far East. It was 4 o'clock in the morning for her, and she was waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning to come to class. And the other student, it was in the middle of the night. The one that was in the UK, it was already late. So that was a challenge. That was a huge challenge, and we've sort of gotten out of it, thankfully, because what's most important is direct human contact.
Sure.
And that's something that we're doing this interview on Zoom. I would love to do it live, but it is what it is, right? We're stuck with our realities.
Yeah, and I think it's also accepted more now. I mean, I'd love to be in a studio with you because I feel that energy, the way that the mirror neurons feed off of each other, that
Yeah,
interaction, and actually feeling people. You want
yeah.
to talk about physically feeling, but emotionally feeling and going off each other's energy. So I think it's been one of the biggest losses, which I also think leads to more anxiety, stress, and isolation
Yeah.
because we're not made to be alone. Our solitary confinement has a
Yeah,
devastating.
and you bring up a really important point, Dan, is that a lot of people became very, very isolated during COVID, and some of them still are isolated, and we don't know the long-term effects of it. We don't know the long-term effects of children who were born during COVID, because their first 2, 3 years they were very, very isolated. and had very little social interaction with anybody except the people right around them. They didn't, there weren't friendships, there weren't play groups. So we don't know what the long-term implications of that is.
I think it's going to be, look, we're creatures of habit and we adapt to our environment. We become our environment. And I think a lot of people became comfortable being isolated,
Yeah.
not realizing there's a neurological effect as well as a physiological effect. And now stepping out of our comfort zone of dealing with things that, because we become very separated as a community, society, if I want to say impregnated thoughts, because we watch social media that can be manipulated to be whatever we want it to be. I think people have become uncomfortable. I remember I had a guy living with me in the house, great guy. I'd found him, he was homeless. And I said, look, let's get you going back in life again. And he came to me and said, there's this girl, we got him a job. And he goes, this girl I really like. I said, why don't you ask her out then? He goes, well, I don't know how to tell her or, speak. And I said, well, why didn't you just give her a call? He goes, I don't know what to say. But you know what? I'll text her. So he goes on social media, sends her a message and says, do you want to go on a hike sometime? But he couldn't do it in real life. What's that going to do to us as human race if we don't start re-engaging with each other? Because that's really where our beauty and passion exist.
Yeah, the re-engaging is absolutely critical. And I think ultimately, I mean, many of us still have a version of post-traumatic stress from the pandemic. And the early days of the pandemic were terrible, had a tremendous effect on stress, anxiety, and it was horrible. And then, in 2020, remember what happened in 2020? We had an election. We had a divided country. We had, it was horrible. People have already forgotten how bad it was. It's like their brains, they have amnesia for 4 years. They don't remember how bad it actually was during COVID, and because it was terrible.
Absolutely. And again, like you said, we've learned to fit what fits us.
Yeah.
And that means when we become comfortable and we're not challenging ourselves, then there's no growth. But comfort is the biggest enemy of success.
Yeah.
Because we sit back and we just make everything fit what we want. That brings me back into something to do with sleep. What is the difference between going to bed and the sleep effect on us from 10 o'clock at night to midnight for 2 hours earlier in the circadian rhythm as we should be, compared to going to bed at midnight and maybe sleeping to 6? Is there a big variance in the effect on the body going to sleep earlier than later?
Different people have different circadian rhythms. Some people, the vast majority of the population will go to bed between 11 and 11:30. And again, there are geographic differences, by the way. But most of the time it's between 11 and 11:30. But there are big swaths of the population that go to bed much earlier. I have friends here, you can't phone them after 8 o'clock because they're getting ready for bed. They typically will wake up at 4 in the morning and, start their day while it's dark. And there are other people who don't get sleepy until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And they do best if they sleep in until 10, 11, or noon. We have different propensities. We have different circadian clocks, all of us. And the key thing is to recognize what your pattern is when you get sleepy and go to bed when you actually get sleepy. There are instruments out there where you can determine whether you're an owl or whether you're a morning lark in terms of your own circadian rhythm. But most people kind of know that. Most people actually know when they should be going to bed, and they know when they should be getting up, and they need to do what they know.
I remember as a kid growing up, you were either a night owl or a morning person. And that divided how we were. It was that simple back then. Is that, though, partly trained? Like, can you change your rhythm relative to, I just got used to staying up late. I should be going to bed early, but now I just got into that habit because my body now functions on 8 hours of sleep from midnight to 8 in the morning.
I can tell you that people have a circadian rhythm that usually has developed pretty well by their mid-teens or late teens, and sometimes and generally with during the teenage years, sleepiness comes on later and later and later. And you were in show business at one point, from what I understand. And I'll bet you that if you asked all the performers what their circadian rhythm is, they will all tell you the same thing. I don't go to sleep until 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I won't wake up until 11 o'clock or noon, because that's how I function. And then you have a performance at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock that evening, and you do fine. You get very jazzed up as a performer, and there's no way that you're going to fall asleep having just finished a performance at 10 or 10:30, because you've had to take a train to get home. You're not home until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And just as well, this is the circadian rhythm of performance, of performers. It's the circadian rhythm of people that own restaurants. When I see a teenager, who tells me that they don't go to bed until 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and they're always like this, and I don't try to talk them out of this rhythm, because that's their rhythm, right? So what I tell them is, do not become an anesthesiologist, right? Find the career that is consistent with your own circadian rhythm, that's consistent with your own body.
Which brings me to the point. Good, really nice guy, Holden. He works, what's it called? The night watch, the night shift, going through there. And he'll finish at like 6 in the morning, drive home when the sun's coming up, or in the winter, the sun's, isn't even up yet. He'll sleep until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and then come back to work. So we know light is important at a cellular level for our energy, for the mitochondria, all the other stuff. How does someone that they sleep through the day and work through the night, how do they get the best benefits, both of sleep, but also the natural remedies that we should be having too?
Well, one of the things I try to tell people is that I don't advise that people do those kind of jobs unless they're a real night person. And there are people out there that love the night. They're awake during the night. They are like the nocturnal animals that are out there that wander around at night, and they sleep during the daytime. There are people like that. And I remember when I first worked in an ICU, there were people who were nurses who had worked in the ICU for, decades, and they loved to work at night. This was they were night people. But if someone isn't a night person and is forced to work nights for economic reasons or other reasons, I tell them, you need to decide what you want to do with your life. Is there another possibility for a job for you that's more consistent with your rhythm? You'll feel better. Think about that. And there are some people who say, you know what, this job isn't worth it. I'm going to look for something else because I don't like the way I feel. And other people say, I have no choice. I have to pay the rent. I have to pay the babysitter, daycare, whatever. And that's the situation. And so people need to understand what their own rhythm is and make the most of it. Because that's when they'll function at their best, and that's maybe how they'll become superhuman.
And for them, though, someone that goes to bed at 10 o'clock at night and wakes up at 6 in the morning is the same effect physiologically and mentally as someone that goes to bed at 8 in the morning and sleeps till 4 in the afternoon. As long as they get their 8 hours, they're still good? Or is there a negative?
It's better than nothing. But it turns out that if you look at the population of shift workers versus the population of people that don't work shift, it turns out shift workers sleep a lot less. They sleep about an hour per night less. Why? Because the world is not geared to you being asleep during the daytime. You're going to be getting phone calls. Your computer is going to go off. Your phone is going to ping. The world functions sort of in the daytime most of the time. Your next door neighbor is going to mow the lawn during the day while you're trying to sleep. So trying to have a nighttime job and sleeping during the daytime is really tough.
One of the things that I know people have, and we talked about this, the having to wake up in the middle of the night, especially the aging population that said, I don't like to drink for a couple of hours before I go to bed. because now I know I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night and have to go to the bathroom. So they don't drink. So they go into sleep already dehydrated. They sleep their 8 hours. They wake up in the morning. They got the headache. They got a slight memory loss. They don't feel functional in their body movement and they're dehydrated. And the first thing they're going to do is go and grab a cup of coffee. How important is hydration before sleep?
Well, hydration is important not just before sleep, it's always important. If they have a normal urinary system, drinking the right amount before going to bed, they're not going to go to the bathroom because of that. If they have to go to the bathroom at night, it's because there's something else going on. It's either a medical issue, diabetes, big prostate, or some people just get into the habit of going to the bathroom at night if they happen to wake up. And so there are a lot of causes for that. But in general, if someone wakes up from their sleep period and they feel wide awake and alert and they have a great day, they don't have a sleep problem. I don't care if they wake up 5 times during the night. If they feel great and they function really well, I don't recommend any treatment.
It's great because what you're ultimately saying is everyone's unique and they
Yeah.
should be and fit themselves and don't get caught up in other people's expectations. If it's working for you, then
Yeah.
stick with it ultimately. Just going looking at these other things. I know time is pressing. I know you're a busy man as well. Yeah, I think we've covered so much that's in here. Is there anything? Okay, so let me start on this one. Oh, there's one thing, one question I had. You said that you studied with people that had altitude disease that was
Mhm.
affecting their sleep. Yet we were always brought up to believe that altitude was a great place to sleep. Yeah, when I was an athlete, again, I actually had an oxygen tent, an altitude tent on my bed that I would sleep anywhere from 9,500 feet. And during the day, I'd sit at 21,500 for 5 minutes at a time because of the lower in the oxygen. Got the red blood cells going. I could then create more and I could recover better when I, raced at sea level. Tell me about the altitude sleep issues.
Yeah, so if you go to altitude acutely, right, and I guess some people will have an effect simply going from sea level to Denver, believe it or not. But in most of the time, it's somewhere around 9 or 10,000 feet that you will start having problems. And the problems are in the control of breathing. In other words, your breathing becomes abnormal and you develop what we call a periodic breathing pattern. And your breathing pattern will actually wake you up. And so I know that sleeping at high altitude, a lot of athletes do this. And the main benefit they get out of this is actually if they can raise their red blood cells. Because if your blood oxygen is low, you're going to produce more red blood cells by a mechanism where the kidney actually creates. It increases the production of a hormone called erythropoietin, and your red cell count goes up. For a lot of events, it doesn't matter too much. And I'll tell you why. If you look at animals that are very successful at high altitude, like llamas, guess what their blood count is? They have small red blood cells. It's low. In other words, their red bloods, because when your blood count is too high, your blood becomes sludgy. It's harder to sort of pump it. And there's an ideal size of how many red blood cells you have. So if you're an athlete that runs, for example, 100 meters or 200 meters, basically it's a breath hold. They don't even have to breathe in that 20, in the 10 or 20 seconds, it's a breath hold. So it doesn't matter whether you trained at altitude or not. It has like zero effect. It may have an effect in endurance athletes, but endurance athletes are a very interesting group of people. I actually, when I was in Denver as a fellow, we actually studied marathoners, world-class marathoners, and we looked at what happens to them in terms of the control of their breathing when we lowered their blood oxygen during testing, right? And it turned out, and during exercise, we looked at their breathing during exercise and why they stopped. We did exercise testing on them. Well, it turned out that marathon runners, what made them stop exercising? It was never their breathing. It was always their muscles. It was always their legs. They couldn't do it anymore, right? That's why when we lowered their oxygen, they didn't respond by breathing more. which I found fascinating. In other words, world-class athletes probably have a chemical drive to breathe that is suppressed, as crazy as that sounds. There's a lot to learn from athletes, and if you're interested, and I see you're terrifically interested in sleep, you should bring on Simone Biles, Katie Ledecky, and me, and we can have a really nice discussion about their sleep patterns.
Let's do it. I'd love to do
Let's do
it.
it.
I think it's really, again, education is invaluable when it's shared.
Yeah,
Because, like
yeah,
at the beginning, the first story was how you were affected by one moment. And if people get educated, not everyone's going to take it on. We know not everyone watching this is going to, believe or trust, but there'll be more people that will be interested because they know how important it is. And those are the people that we need to touch
yeah.
first. And then the culture begins to change. Fascinating. No, I'd love to do that. I love the everything that you're doing. I love everything you've done. I know even though you officially retired back in 2022, I know you're still fully participating in continuing to learn, which I think we'll never stop doing. There's always going to be learning coming on. What's next for you?
Well, next is in 2 weeks, I'm going to start teaching my undergraduate course at Yale. And one of the really neat things about the course, I don't know how familiar you are with the students Yale is basically a humanities school. And I get the most wonderful patients, the most wonderful students. And one of the things that I try to teach them is how to integrate what they learn in the course into their own life. I have students who are athletes. I have students who are theater majors. I have students who are art majors. I have students who are in cognitive sciences. I try to get them to integrate what they have learned about sleep into their life and the art forms that they're part of. I can send you an interesting link that shows you how students express themselves in the course. I had a student who was doing dance. She was a dance major. And she actually created and choreographed a dance to explain a disease called narcolepsy.
Hmm.
I'll send you that link. I'll send it right now, and you can have a look at it. And so this is what I love about dealing with students, undergraduate students. They're not jaded. They're not cynical. They're sponges. They want to learn. I'm interested in how they express themselves and the things that they have learned in the course to better their own lives.
I agree that people are more open, they're more challenging and questioning. Because when we were born, we basically signed an agreement, a
Yeah,
social agreement, without even knowing it, that we would not challenge, we'd just fit in. And that's why I say we're born superhuman, but we're slowly dumbed down by somebody else's opinion not to challenge. And fascinating. I'd love you really quickly before we end this. You were going to bring up a slide about athletes.
yeah,
Would you go ahead and share that? Because I can drop
yeah.
that into when you talked about it. So to finish up, is there anything else that you'd love to share or like people to know?
Well, although most of my life is involved in science, I've written a novel and I've written a book on sleep and art.
Tell us about it.
Well, I realized many years ago that when I went into a museum, I'd be attracted to art that depicted sleep. And it turns out that almost every famous artist has done someone sleeping. And I have a whole book that I published, which is available at Amazon, which shows how artists interpreted sleep and the different themes of their art. In some instances, the art had to do with mythology, it had to do with resting, it had to do with lust, it had to do with death, had to do with with waking up, being alert and alive. And so I wrote a book about this, and it's a topic that has always sort of amazed me, that every artist you can think of has actually painted a great image, at least one great image of someone sleeping, and some of them did a bunch of them. Picasso did a bunch of them. Matisse did a bunch of them. Anyways, it's a wonderful book.
And the
At
name of
least
the
I
book
think
is,
it's a wonderful book.
what's the name of the book?
It's called Sleep in Art.
Sleep in Art, and that's on Amazon that people can get
Yeah.
it. That's fantastic. Oh, one thing I got to do for Neil. You talk about the circle ring that I know
Okay.
the chief scientific officer, the different, research and making sure that it's giving feedback as it should at a medical grade. I actually have the circle ring. I've been trying it for the last few days. Tell us more a little bit about it, how people could track their sleep habits, their I know blood pressure, all the different heart rate. Tell us a little bit about the circle ring.
So the circular ring, it's actually a brilliant device that was designed by engineers in China. And when I first became interested in the device before, getting involved with the company, was I wanted to speak to the engineers, and I did. And the first thing I wanted to know was, had they validated the device? How did they validate it? And did they validate it in people with dark skin pigment? Because that was that was known to be a big problem. And I got interested during COVID when I needed to actually be able to monitor some of my patients who were at home. So they had data, and they validated the measurements against blood gases. They actually inserted catheters into arteries. They lowered the oxygen level to the subjects, and they measured both the ring and from arterial blood, which is the best validation out there. And the thing worked, and it worked well, and it worked in the whole, in that whole slew of people. So there are many other rings that are on the market, but they have not been validated. They have not been FDA approved. So this is a medical grade device, and one of the so it measures heart rate. It does heart rate variability, which athletes are very interested in, and it looks at your breathing continuously all night, which is wonderful because we can see patterns in the blood oxygen level that would suggest whether someone has a sleep disorder. I think if someone is having problems with their sleep, if they're snoring, if there's a concern that they have a sleep breathing problem or other problem, I think the future is going to be in wearables like this. And which brings me back to the whole place of wearables in medicine. So when I was in medical school, if a woman thought that she was pregnant, what would she do? She would go to her obstetrician, and the obstetrician would do some testing and say, you're pregnant or you're not pregnant based on the test. That doesn't happen anymore at all. If a woman thinks that she's pregnant, the first thing she does is she goes to a drugstore or orders online a pregnancy kit of some sort. If she's pregnant, she will then go to the doctor. And I think that's the era that we're entering now, where people are going to be sort of doing a bit of self-monitoring to see if they have a measurable problem. And then they'll go to the doctor and say, I think I have a sleep breathing problem or hypertension or whatever, or rhythm abnormality, and it needs to be investigated. So, for example, the Apple Watch can detect atrial fibrillation. It does a great job at it. And so people need to be thinking about that approach, that if they have a problem, is there a good wearable that they can use, or should they go straight to a doctor if it's very significant?
Fantastic. Well, I so appreciate you being here today. It's nice when they say go talk to the horse's mouth. I spoke to the king's mouth. So
Thank you.
thank you so much for sharing your lifetime of knowledge. And I know there'll be more than one person that will take this out and realize how important sleep is, how dynamic the effect of good or bad sleep is on our lifestyle, on our health, and then be the example for those around. Because again, we've got to build the culture of self-care, self-love, and letting the body be everything that it's born to be.
That's absolutely true, and that's great.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.